right. Hi, everybody. Hi, Grace.
Hi, Kimber. How are you?
I am doing good. How are you?
Pretty good. Excited to be here.
We're excited to have you. You know, I love chatting with you whenever we get a chance.
Yeah, feeling is so mutual.
Well, thanks everybody for joining us. We're going to do some introductions and a couple little housekeeping notes here before we actually get started on the conversation. I'm Camber. I am a marketing manager at GiveWP and have worked with Grace a handful of times. And Grace Green, if you do not know her, you should. She is a partnership success specialist at Double the Donation, which is the leading automated matching gift software provider for nonprofits and educational institutions. Through Double the Donations Partnership Program, Grace is able to work with other nonprofit technology leaders to empower organizations and help drive donations through employer matching gift programs. Grace and her team are committed to closing the billion-dollar fundraising gap between fundraising organizations and corporate giving programs to help organizations accomplish more good. Grace, tell us a little bit more about corporate gift matching before we get started.
Absolutely. So, corporate gift matching is pretty much exactly what it sounds like, but I know there's a lot of different types of gift matching and gift matching campaigns and things like that. So, when you're thinking of corporate gift matching, what you're really referring to is the idea that a company will match the charitable contributions of their employers. So, if you're thinking of a really literal definition here, let's say I worked for the Home Depot, I made a donation to my local animal shelter of $100. I go back and I tell Home Depot, hey, I just made this $100 donation. I would like you to make a matching donation. And in that case, Home Depot would go in and make an additional $100 donation to that local animal shelter.
Mm-hmm. And we touched on that gap with the $1 billion gap right now, which that number blows my mind every time I hear it because it's like it's free money. Like, why are we not more tuned into whether or not our employers do gift matching which a big portion of them do. So from that perspective, how do you guys encourage, I mean, other than obviously your software, how do you encourage people to just understand whether or not employers are gift matching?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think just to kind of your point, the biggest barrier here is really donor awareness.
Mm-hmm.
If a donor isn't aware that these programs are available to them, then they're never going to kind of take the next steps. And unfortunately, it's often something that is only mentioned in HR offices, or maybe it's on like page 32 of
Yeah.
your employee handbook, and you're on page 4 where it talks about health insurance and you never get past that.
Yeah.
Um, so it's a very understandable kind of gap there. And so what we really try and do is make donors aware by incorporating an ask into the donation process and really just putting that idea in donors' minds as they're giving, especially once you kind of generate that momentum and make sure a donor knows about a program once they're likely to talk about it. Because like you said, it's free money. So if
Yeah.
I know that my company is going to make a $100 donation or whatever the matching amount is to an organization that I really care about, then that's all of the more incentive to
Mm-hmm.
request a donation match in the future, or to tell your best friend at work about it, or
Yeah.
to ask your spouse or your significant other if their company does that. And so it just kind of really gets the ball rolling. And so what
Mm-hmm.
I would really recommend is just introducing it early and often to make sure that you can kind of close that donor awareness gap and put it in
Mm-hmm.
front of them.
Yeah. And so today we're talking about corporate social responsibility, which I personally would say that corporate gift matching probably falls under CSR initiatives. So that's why you're here today, because it is absolutely an initiative. I'm going to drop some links in the chat really quick, and these links are going to give you some more information about the GiveWP integration with Double the Donation. And there's also a link to the article that Adam at Double the Donation wrote for us on corporate social responsibility. So definitely give those a peek. Give me 2 seconds while I drop these in there. I usually have someone helping me, but not today. So that's okay. So, like I said, today we're going to talk about corporate social responsibility. And what I would love to know first, Grace, is I know there's some nuance and some conversations around what corporate social responsibility actually is, but let's just kind of talk about from an overview what corporate social responsibility means.
Absolutely. And so the term corporate social responsibility, and a lot of you may have heard it as like CSR,
Mm-hmm.
or sometimes people use corporate philanthropy interchangeably. I think there's a lot of kind of options here of what the verbiage is, and so that can make it a little bit confusing too. But essentially, corporate social responsibility just refers to the voluntary actions or practices that a company takes to improve its overall impact on society.
Mhm.
So, like you mentioned, corporate matching gifts falling into this, it's because CSR initiatives or corporate social responsibility initiatives often promote corporate philanthropy practices, which is kind of the act of a corporation promoting the welfare of others. And that often looks like charitable contributions of either money or time.
Mhm.
Really, this idea that a company should give back. And
Mhm.
more recently, I would say within like the last decade or so, we've seen a really big uptick in the way that we expect companies to engage in corporate social
Mhm.
responsibility. I know we'll talk a lot about that
Mhm.
kind of later on throughout today, but I think that's something to think about and why it's at the forefront of a lot of our minds is because we've really seen it take off in a way that we hadn't before.
Yeah, and you're right. We will definitely get into, what CSR initiatives mean, especially to consumers, and why that's important in a little bit. But it is one of my favorite parts of CSR is really talking through like how important it is to consumers, to know that the companies that they're dealing with are doing something towards social good. So when we're talking about like these acts, we're talking about generally different types of CSR initiatives. With there are four types that are generally, initiatives generally fall under, which are environmental, ethical, economic, and philanthropic. Can you like give us just a little bit more information around these different types of CSR initiatives?
Definitely. So I think one just kind of clarifying point is a lot of times, and I'm guilty of this too, is when we think CSR, we immediately think philanthropy. We're
Hmm.
immediately thinking, how are they giving back? What are they doing in the community? And while that is true, and that's a big part of it, there are, like you mentioned, kind of four components that go into it
Hmm.
that aren't as directly charitable as you might think, but are still really important to having strong brand identity, strong business practices that are received well by the public.
Hmm.
So, environmental is relatively straightforward, reducing waste and emissions or prioritizing renewable resources, conserving
Hmm.
energy, supporting environmental nonprofits if that's something that you're doing, but essentially just not making the planet move backwards in a sense
Right.
so that safe and environmentally sound practices a lot of times that's also refers to making sure that if you're like an oil company that you are doing everything you can to minimize the possibility of an oil spill,
Hmm.
or if you are a company that is using renewable resources that you're promoting that in the correct way and you kind of have
Yeah.
all of these guidelines that you follow. So environmental is relatively literal. It's just that like is your company doing right by the environment?
Hmm.
Ethical, also pretty similar in that it's very literal. Safe working conditions. Are you providing fair wages? Are you
Hmm.
legally compliant with privacy laws or things like that, just to make sure that your business is operating in the way that it's supposed to? And then in recent years, we've seen kind of an uptick in
Hmm.
successfully instituting and maintaining diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So, like implementing and maintaining DEI at your organization would fall under kind of the ethical CSR branch. But
Hmm.
again, it's just this idea of sound business practices and is
Hmm.
your company engaging in these?
Hmm.
And then economic, again, financial transparency, making sure that you are following SEC standards and that you are kind of sharing information with stakeholders the way that you're supposed to. If you're um, based in the US, are you investing in local small businesses and supporting local suppliers? Kind of just being cognizant of the way that your organization can engage with the economy beyond like just the scope of profit.
Right. The economic impact that your business has globally or regionally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, of course, lastly, philanthropic. I think this is the one that we most often think of,
Yeah.
but it's just giving back to the surrounding community, oftentimes through this idea of corporate philanthropy that we've talked about. But I think something that's interesting and kind of ties back into these four pieces is this idea we've seen over the past, let's say, 5 or 6 years, maybe older than that, but I think it's become more commonplace in the past couple of years, is the establishment of the new triple bottom line.
Hmm.
And this is something that the Harvard Business Review has written about. But we're all used to hearing that the bottom line is profit, and then we expanded, and the bottom line was profit and people. And so
Hmm.
now this concept of the new triple bottom line actually refers to profit, people, planet.
Yeah.
And so that really encompasses and illustrates this idea of these 4 different CSR initiatives, because Profit, People, and Planet really encompass all of the 4 different initiatives that we just kind of quickly ran through. And it
Mhm.
helps us understand the way that CSR exists to directly support the surrounding community or the surrounding people or the surrounding planet that we
Yeah.
all share.
Yeah, wonderful. And so when we're talking about the way that CSR can like financially benefit nonprofits, and I know we will get into that a little bit more too, but can you just give us kind of an overview, especially as it relates to, double donation, corporate gift matching, volunteer time off, that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So CSR initiatives have a lot of kind of different ways that they can engage to directly financially benefit nonprofits. Matching gifts are the one that we see kind of the most often, and that makes a lot of sense considering what we do. But so matching gifts are a great one. Similar is payroll deductions. So setting up that every time you get paid, you're just making an immediate donation to a nonprofit close to you. I know you mentioned volunteer grants. That's something that we've also seen on the rise, or something like VTO. So volunteer time off is something that's becoming more common. And it's just this idea that your employees are able to use their time to go and support the community. And that can be maybe in a group. So entire segments or teams are taking the day off to go volunteer. Or if
Mhm.
you are in a smaller company, maybe you're a singular person, or if you're fully remote and you just take and are working with nonprofits local to you. We also see corporate sponsorships. So maybe that is them sponsoring an event that you're putting on, or maybe that's partnering together for like a one off matching gift program or things like that. So there's a lot of different CSR initiatives that come out of this that can actually directly financially benefit nonprofits,
Mhm.
whether it's in kind donations or matching gifts, payroll deductions, and so on and so forth.
Perfect. And so I kind of want to like go back to what we talked about in the beginning, which is why, CSR has been such a hot topic over the last several years, but specifically, I feel like it's had a really big push, maybe like the last 5 years. Not a new thing by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's becoming something that's more talked about, especially from a consumer point of view. So let's talk a little bit about like what CSR means for companies and why it's something that they're starting to like really, really consider even on a smaller level.
Yeah. So I think one of the big things, and that we were all kind of had a weird front seat to in the past couple of years, is this idea of like the great resignation or the great reshuffling, people moving jobs, people having a lot more power as the interviewee or as the
Mhm.
that person who was applying. And so I think that part of the reason is so CSR is so important right now is because it has a lot of benefits for the company, in addition to the benefits that it has for society or a nonprofit and so on and so forth. And so there's a lot of positive brand awareness. There's a lot of positive engagement. Consumers typically want to engage with companies that they know are philanthropically minded. I know there's a couple that probably come right to mind when you're thinking, oh, what is a philanthropically minded company? I know for me, it's Patagonia. I always think of
Mhm.
them as kind of the first one. They are very clear from the get go of how the environment is related to their mission, and how all of their kind of steps that they take are coming back to that environmental CSR initiative that they have. And so we really see in the research that we've done at Double Donation, and also in kind of surrounding just nonprofit research and greater kind of corporate experience research, that 77% of consumers aim to support socially responsible companies. And so it's not enough to just say that you're socially responsible. It's now you kind of have to take the next steps and
Mhm.
say, okay, what are we going to do here? What is this going to look like? How can we really make sure that we are engaging with employees, with the surrounding community, and with everyone to make sure it's clear that we
Mhm.
are promoting these initiatives?
Mhm. And it's something when we're talking about, you have to do what you say you're doing. What I think is particularly interesting is that Gen Z has like access and will find anything about your company. So, especially like not only do you obviously you want to talk the talk and walk the walk at any given moment, but Gen Z will find out if you're not actually, following through with your initiatives. And it's really important to set those CSR initiatives in place, be transparent with what you're doing, and be really open about, what's going on with your initiatives so that you're future proofing your business as well. Because the younger generations, millennials and younger, it is so imperative to them that they are being socially responsible with their money and that they're purchasing from places that they feel are, aligned with their own personal values. And there's some other things too that are pretty important. And when we talk about from like a company perspective, a lot of times CSR initiatives are really important for employee churn, right? Like a lot of folks my age, your age, want to work somewhere where they feel like they're giving back in some way. I mean, you and I both work for companies that directly deal with nonprofits, and I'm sure that's part of the reason why we work where we do. So from a benefits perspective, we've talked a little bit about, how consumers benefit from it and how companies benefit from it, but let's talk a little bit about nonprofit organizations benefiting from CSR initiatives.
Absolutely. So I think one of the things that we kind of touched on a little bit earlier is this idea of that direct additional funding. And so for the nonprofits, I think that's kind of the most
Mm-hmm.
point A to point B literal relationship that you have when
Yeah.
it comes to CSR initiatives, because it is those matching gifts, it is those payroll deductions, it's those corporate sponsorships. And so I think it really allows nonprofits to grow and build in the community. Especially, I think one thing that is growing out of CSR initiatives, and I hope continues to grow and kind of continues to evolve, is this idea that nonprofits can route um, in their own community and get connected with local businesses and
Mm-hmm.
local organizations and find people who are kind of on the same page as them,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe who have similar audience overlap and things like that. So a nonprofit benefit is going to be kind of just the direct, let's build a relationship. Let's
Yeah.
find a way that you can support us in a one-off matching campaign, or maybe you directly connect your employers or your employees, excuse me, to our organization, so that
Mm-hmm.
once a quarter you guys are doing a volunteer day, or once a
Mm-hmm.
quarter you are connecting with us and we are having Saturdays where you come and do a volunteer day, or finding ways kind of to engage directly with the nonprofit, I think is
Mm-hmm.
something that has come out of CSR initiatives previously and kind of will continue to be incorporated.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to think about all the different ways that nonprofits can kind of leverage their local communities to have a positive impact on their own missions. And I mean, whether you're a food bank and you're partnering with a local grocery store, or you're partnering with a local school to do a food drive or whatever, those are all CSR initiatives. Sometimes they are a one time campaign, like you've mentioned, and sometimes they are more long term things. But there's just so many different ways that nonprofits specifically can work with other organizations, for profit or other nonprofits as well, within their community. And I think that when we talk about CSR, it's this like big, huge looming thing. And it's like, well, I don't know where to get started. I don't know what to do. Or it feels like, well, it's just it's a volunteer time off and I don't know how to make sure that I'm getting that time. So that's why I'm really excited to have you here. And we are going to talk about leveraging CSR initiatives within the nonprofit sector, and kind of like what you looked at, which you alluded to earlier when you talked about like the shared audiences and stuff. But so how would a nonprofit organization go about finding out, like what for-profit companies in their region specifically are aligned with their values and their goals, and then how would they go about kind of creating a partnership?
Yeah, great question. So I think something that you mentioned just a couple of minutes ago is something that I want to call out again, is
Mm-hmm.
this idea of both of us work at organizations that directly work with nonprofits. And I think that's the kind of information that you want to hone in on. So I think my first recommendation would be know where your donors work. Not everyone has the luxury of working at an organization or a company that is like directly connected to the things that they care about or the
Mm-hmm.
work that they feel impassioned by. But I do think it's important to kind of keep that in mind, especially because there might be some overlap there.
Mm-hmm.
Or, like I mentioned in the very beginning, if I'm thinking that I work for the Home Depot, Well, if I am, let's say, an Atlanta based nonprofit and I have quite a few donors who work at Home Depot, maybe that's kind of the hint I need to get started. And so I think
Hmm.
really knowing where your donors work is going to be a great place to kind of kick off from. And then
Hmm.
you can kind of build off of that information and then engage accordingly. I think also when you're thinking of how can we work with and engage with organizations that are aligned with us or maybe have the same audience as us or maybe even just want the same things as us,
Hmm.
I think it also starts with making sure that you understand where you are as a nonprofit and kind of what your values sets look like. I know that it's easy to be like, well, we'll work with anyone who wants to work with us kind of thing.
Hmm.
But when it gets down to it and connecting with your donor base and keeping engaged with them, it's important to first outline what your mission is and what you're trying to accomplish, and then kind of work with companies that want or will be willing to work towards a similar initiative. I think
Hmm.
a really easy call out here is, let's say you are a children's hospital or you are a health and human services related organization. Maybe you probably don't want to partner with a local tobacco company
Right.
or something like that. That's
Right.
obviously very straightforward, but it's
Right.
things like that that you want to consider is making sure that you're engaging in partnerships that don't discredit your mission or don't
Hmm.
discredit the dollars that your donors are willing to give you or the time that your supporters are willing to donate. It's making sure that you're engaging in a way that reaffirms people's connection to your mission. And so
Hmm.
I think just outlining what you want and then deciding what makes sense, and obviously leverage your network if there
Yeah.
are connections where employees at your organization have worked previously
Hmm.
or family and friends connections there. I think leave no stone unturned when it
Hmm.
comes to engaging in these kind of CSR partnerships. And then also, you're allowed to be selective. I know that's not always something that nonprofits hear, but you are, when you're engaging in these partnerships, you're allowed to say, we want to work with you for XYZ reason, and we don't want to work with for you for ABC reason. That's kind
Hmm.
of a position that you're allowed to take. And I think that's just a nice reminder.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of like dig in a little bit more on what you're saying, I used to work for a company who they did like a fundraising campaign for St. Jude every year. And the local St. Jude chapter had the wherewithal to go, okay, we have a, branch of this company here. Let's reach out and see if locally they want to volunteer for our walk or they want to participate in some other way. And I ended up joining their fundraising board, and a lot of people participated in like a much bigger way than just giving money. So things like that are super important. And then also, there was something else on the tip of my head, and now it's like gone. So I might have to come back to that. But I think you make some really good points, and I think it's really easy to get caught up in this idea that like not that things aren't an emergency, but this idea that you just have to take whatever is handed to you. And it's really, really, really important, especially when it comes to corporate social responsibility initiatives, that, like you said, you're partnering with folks who maybe they say they want the same thing as you, but like from a from an optic standpoint, is that actually the best partnership for you? And we talk about this all the time in marketing, where you don't want to get caught up in another company's like downfall because you're associated with them. So it's just really important to do your due diligence, do your research, meet with people. And if you feel like the vibes are off at all, like maybe take a step back and maybe come back to it. But when we're talking about CSR, something that we get asked a lot is, and I think we think about it a lot too, just watching like layoffs happen. There's tons today. Meta announced more and Disney announced more. There's just a ton of layoffs happening. And so, there's a housing crisis and there's a big economic downturn coming our way. And I think a lot of folks assume that if companies are going to start, trimming the fat in whatever way, that a CSR initiative is going to be something that goes pretty quickly. And I know that we have found that that's not really the case. And that sometimes there's actually an expansion of corporate giving during an economic downturn. Can you give us just like a little bit more detail around that?
Definitely. So you're exactly right. I totally understand why it can be a little daunting or a little concerning as to, hey, if my next door neighbor just got laid off, then what's next for my nonprofit? And kind of what does that look like as it relates to our corporate sponsorships and all of those pieces? But like you mentioned, companies often respond in a positive way during this kind of economic uncertainty, just because, again, with what we were talking about at the very beginning, CSR initiatives are important for their brand. And so, in the same way that they are, quote unquote, trying to trim the fat, they're also trying to stay afloat. And so that looks like retaining employees and keeping profit margins and making sure that they're able to engage in a way that does not lose consumer trust in their business. And so, what that often looks like is companies finding ways to engage in these CSR initiatives, either in different or even larger ways, to make sure that they're able to maintain kind of that brand awareness, that positive light, to make sure that when and if the dust settles, they're able to come out on top. There's actually, in the recession of 2008, the GE CEO, the General Electric CEO at the time, had a quote that I think like kind of sums this up perfectly. So I actually pulled it up here so I could say it for you guys. And so the GE CEO at the time in 2008 said, "When we come out of this fog," as in the recession, this notion that companies need to stand for something, that they need to be accountable for more than just the money they earn, is going to be profound. And so I think we've seen that continue to expand. And so, despite GE's stock price falling 55% in 2008, they grew their philanthropic giving by 13.6%. And so, I think it's this idea that companies need to engage in society, in the community, in more ways than just having profit, and more ways than just making the most that they can possibly make. Obviously, it's not a perfect world, so that doesn't happen every single time, but I think we're able to have companies engage in this kind of economic uncertainty and give a little bit of solace in times where we're not going to remove these programs. We're going to continue to engage in these and continue to support our community in ways that we can. Similarly, I know that during the onset of the COVID pandemic in kind of March 2020, that was a really scary time for a lot of people. And companies often upped their charitable responses during that time
Mhm.
through CSR initiatives. So General Mills increased the maximum matching gift amount by 50% per employee to give them greater opportunity to give back. And I think that's something that I personally really love about matching gifts. Obviously, I'm a little biased, but I think matching gifts, especially, can be really valuable because it allows the employee and donor to connect to the company or the mission that aligns most with them and allow their company to follow suit. So, especially if you're thinking in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, giving to food banks and giving to community aspects that are close to you and close to home, and then allowing your company to continue to engage and back you up there, is going to be really valuable. And again, companies recognize the value in that, and the value in retaining employees and keeping them afloat even during this kind of time of economic uncertainty.
Mhm. And so when we're talking about like economic uncertainty specifically, I think it's really important to think about even like say you have a partnership, with a regional company. I think it's really important to think about like how you can be open and communicate with that company throughout this uncertain time. And maybe you need to go back and do like another like needs based assessment and say like, hey, listen, like I know that we had this partnership. This is happening. I just want to be really transparent and honest with you about what we need. And so I think it's really important to understand that even though maybe you've got a partnership that you set out from the beginning, there's we all know, especially those of us that work in the nonprofit sector or hand in hand with nonprofit sector, that it is a constantly evolving landscape, and what your organization needed yesterday may not be what your organization needs today. And so I think it's also a matter of just ensuring that you're being really transparent with whoever your partners are, and going to them and saying like, hey, actually some things have changed, and would you be open to doing this, that, or the other thing. During COVID, if you probably had a much more, if you're a food pantry, you probably had way more people coming to your pantry than you had previously. And maybe you do have a partnership with like a grocery store, and you're able to go to them and say, hey, is there any way that we could maybe increase this, or what are my options to ensure that I'm able to give back to the community at the rate at which it's necessary right now?
I would even add to that too, if we were thinking about something that we talked about just a couple of minutes ago, this idea of how can you identify CSR
Mm-hmm.
partnerships and how can you find those? I think in the same vein that you just mentioned, Camber, of being transparent on the nonprofit side, I think that's a
Mm-hmm.
really fair expectation to set from the beginning on the corporation side of things as well. And so when
Mm-hmm.
you're looking to engage in those partnerships or narrow down who you might want to work with in the community, I think expecting and setting those needs and being we want to be really transparent. So if you have financial issues that are coming up that may affect our partnership, we want to know that. We want to
Yeah.
be true partners in this sense. And so I think that's a really great call out to just remember that it's a two-way street, and the same
Mm-hmm.
kind of transparency that you allot to your corporate partners, you should want that same from them.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of like creating those relationships, it's not as simple as, sorry, we're moving into the Q&A now because we've got some questions coming in, but it just happened to go with what we were talking about. So when we're talking about building these relationships, sometimes it is as simple as walking in and saying, hey, you know what, this is what my organization does. I think that we're really well aligned. Can we talk about creating some sort of partnership? And sometimes it's a little bit more complicated and nuanced than that. Sometimes you really do have to lay a foundation and start to build a relationship before you can approach someone about creating, some sort of partnership based on whatever their CSR initiatives are, whether actually, and they may not even have them. Sometimes you might have to help them build them. So the question was like, where can nonprofit organizations kind of start to build those relationships? And for me, the first thing that comes to mind is your local chamber of commerce. Signing up to be a member and going to those meetings and kind of getting to know folks, and then leveraging your own network. Do you have any other like suggestions for that? Like really that relationship building?
Yeah, so I want to second. I think leveraging your own network and understanding kind of where you're at in the community is going to be really helpful. And then similarly, also just taking kind of stock of what existing partnerships you may have had, what you may have had in
Mhm.
the past, and then looking to the future of what you might want out of a partnership. So again, it comes down to kind of this needs setting or this goal setting from the beginning of saying, okay, what do we want out of a partnership? And that can help you narrow it down. So if you want a really close, tangible partnership, maybe then you want to focus on companies that have 50 to 200 employees. Or
Mhm.
if you want something that is primarily monetary and not too like close quartered, then maybe you're looking for companies with only 1,000 plus employees. And so I
Right.
think one, just kind of setting the stage for what you want. And then also coming back to this idea of where do your donors work? Is there anything that you can
Mhm.
leverage there to start a conversation? Because it's definitely going to kind of get the ball rolling if you can
Mhm.
come to a corporation and say, hey, did you know in the last year we received donations from 20 of your employees? I think there's
Mhm.
something there. We should talk about it. And so
Mhm.
just kind of coming equipped and making sure that you're able to make a case for yourself and explain why this could be really valuable.
Mhm. And so, coming back to sort of that economic downturn conversation that we were having, we've talked about matching gift programs, which we can continue to talk about, obviously, because they're very important. But something that's being asked is how you, as a nonprofit, kind of navigate an economic downturn. And especially if you've got, maybe you already have an existing partnership or you're trying to create a partnership that's mainly monetary at this point, right? Because sometimes folks feel like they don't have the ability to give money at that time. So making sure that I think the question is just making sure that you're leaving space open for non-monetary gifts, which sometimes that looks like, volunteer grants and in-kind donations. So how do you feel like people can go ahead and have that conversation with partners?
I think that's a great idea. And I think you can take a similar stance that you might take towards your donors, of this idea of meeting your donors where they are and also meeting corporations where they are. If you're
Mhm.
understanding that maybe there's staff changes, or maybe even it's something less daunting as economic uncertainty and it's leadership turnover, and your
Mhm.
main point of contact is no longer at the corporation that you've been partnered with, kind of how do you navigate that? So I think something to understand and keep in mind is just leveraging the partnership in the ways that you already were. And if that's not going to work, then expanding to provide options. I would
Mhm.
definitely recommend expanding or pivoting to a different type of partnership as opposed to just letting something fizzle out. And
Mhm.
so if maybe you had a primarily monetary partnership and you want to look to, okay, maybe that does look like this company's just going to provide volunteer time for us. Maybe
Mhm.
this is just going to be every time we set up our volunteer sign up, the first people we're going to send it to is
Mhm.
this company. And then we segment to our newsletter and our supporters and so on and so forth. So I think just kind of holding space for, just because they may not be able to give monetarily doesn't mean that they won't be able to give at all. And I
Mhm.
know that it might require some like restructuring or figuring things out to lose that kind of monetary support. But I also think something that's important to keep in mind, but is not always easy to do in times of economic uncertainty, is also looking ahead. And so we've got a lot of hills and valleys and ebbs and flows. And so when we come out of this and we're back to feeling confident and there's a lot of
Mhm.
confidence in the economy, then you want to be able to come back to that partnership and say, look what we were able to do kind of when we were the worriest or we
Yeah.
were the most concerned. And then so now how can we expand that in this time where we're feeling confident and we're feeling ready to engage in new and different ways?
Yeah, and I think it's also important to remember that, and I think we talk about this a lot within the nonprofit sector, is engaging your donors in different ways. So even if you're currently only engaging donors through a part or not donors, you're engaging people through a partnership in a way that is more volunteer oriented or in kind donation oriented, that the more you engage those folks, the more likely that when they are able to give, they will, even if it's not necessarily part of a corporate initiative. You know, they may come to you separately on their own and give. So I think it's also really always important to just keep in mind that any kind of giving is really important. As long as you are open to that and you're kind of allowing people to do what works best for them. The next question is actually about how do you ensure that corporate um, your CSR initiative partnerships are staying on track. So, are there like particular KPIs to track the performance of your initiatives, or kind of just keeping an eye on it? Because at the end of the day, if it's not actually serving you, it is something that you need to, like you said earlier, rework if possible. Or sometimes, unfortunately, you might need to cut ties. But what are some things that, and I know it varies depending on what the actual partnership looks like, but what are some things that you think folks should look out for?
Yeah, I was gonna say there's no like one size fits all for a corporate
Hmm.
sponsorship. Unfortunately, I wish I could be like, well, if they do this, this, and this, then you're good.
Yeah.
But I think that something to keep in mind is really just kind of what benchmarks you're looking for. And it again comes down to this idea of what goals are important to your organization. But I
Hmm.
think something just kind of easy to set is, okay, we want to raise this much money from this corporation in whatever
Hmm.
capacity that looks like.
Hmm.
Maybe it's matching gifts, maybe it's payroll deductions, maybe it's they create a team for your upcoming fundraising event.
Hmm.
But just kind of setting that goal and being able to say, okay, we can rely on Home Depot for $2,000 every year because they always have a great team that comes and does our walk.
Hmm.
Or conversely, maybe it's we want to have the Home Depot team come and hand out 100 meals with us if you're a food
Hmm.
bank or something like that. Or maybe we want them to walk our dogs at our animal shelter once a month. So I think
Right.
again, there's not quite a like universal, oh, this is what a corporate sponsorship would look like. But I
Yep.
think making sure that you feel that it's going both ways, because like we mentioned at the beginning, CSR initiatives are beneficial for companies. They
Hmm.
are something they want to engage in. It's something that gives them positive brand awareness, it gives them engagement, it keeps their employees retained, and so it is something they want to engage with. So I would just first and foremost make sure that you feel like this is going both ways and is not
Hmm.
like entirely transactional where you just feel like, okay, well, Home Depot does this every year so that we can put their logo on our
Right.
banner and call it a day.
Right. And you actually are bringing up a good point, because the next question is about making sure that the partnerships are a win-win partnership, right? So there are all the underlying things that we've talked about for corporations, which is, these things like reduced employee turnover and brand awareness and things like that. But specifically when it comes, and not, we're talking about a walk and putting, logos on t-shirts and things like that. Sometimes that's very important to people and businesses to be able to say, like, hey, we are in partnership with XYZ company, and this is how you know that. So what do you think that looks like, more from like a publicity standpoint, and how nonprofits kind of let folks know, that we are in partnership with this company and we're super grateful for their support. We know they get all those like kind of behind the scenes benefits, but there are a lot of companies who want that, additional recognition.
I think a great place to start is social media. I
Mhm.
know that's seems like a default answer,
Yeah.
but with social media, especially when you're thinking about ways to support and engage a company, again, that's going to go so much further for the company than you as the nonprofit probably even realize, especially when we're thinking about employee retention and
Mhm.
making sure that companies have a positive kind of support and understanding from the community. And so I think social media is obviously a great place to start. Maybe it's like a dedicated grid post on Instagram or something like
Mhm.
that. Maybe it's having like a Facebook banner of we're supported by, and then all of your logos and things like that. So I think it's really, again, just comes down. I know I'm going to sound like a broken record of like deciding what's best for your organization, but really and truly finding out what makes the most sense for your partnerships and
Mhm.
what you can engage with and kind of run with is going to be the most successful. And also, if you're just getting started with these type of initiatives, if you're just kind of dipping your toes into working with companies and kind of engaging with CSR, that's a great way to also ask the company what they're looking for. And again, going all the way full circle to when
Mhm.
you're trying to figure out what makes sense for a partnership, if they're coming to you and saying, well, we expect these 5 things and those 5 things do not align with what you're hoping to do at all, well, then that's an
Mhm.
easy answer for you that maybe this partnership isn't what you wanted it to be. But I think social media is a great place to start. Obviously, like branded merch or anything like that
Right.
is always a great place to start as well. I know people love free t-shirts, and it's free advertising for you and the company.
Yeah. And so the other thing that I wanted to talk about really quick too was something that you mentioned, as far as like, if a company comes to you and says, okay, I'm happy to do this partnership, but I need X, Y, and Z from you. Listen, a lot of our organizations, anyways, that give are small to medium sized organizations. They're staffed by volunteers. They don't necessarily have a whole marketing team. And sometimes it's like, well, I don't have a social media specialist, so I think that there's something to be said there, from just making sure that, like, it does go back to what we were talking about earlier with like just that transparency and honesty, and say, hey, listen, like, we have social media, super happy to do that for you, but I actually don't know how to create a graphic like that. Is there someone that can do? I'm happy to do it. I think it's just making sure that we're just like opening these conversations, and ensuring that there's a feedback loop between the two organizations that just allows you both to be open and honest with each other and get what you need, and ensure that whatever you're doing is purpose driven and helping both organizations out.
I think that's something too that is helpful to keep in mind if you're working with a company as well, is that that also might be their preference, that they're
Mhm.
able to create graphics for you. I know, especially now we're thinking about like big companies or like
Right.
multi-chapter companies and things like that, where they're all over the United States. But a lot of these companies have really strict brand guidelines that they want to
Mhm.
adhere to. And the font in this graphic compared to this
Right.
graphic, it probably looks the same to us, but it looks very different to them. Um,
Yeah.
and so just understanding those things, and again, voicing your needs and saying, hey, we can post on social media, not a problem at all, but we cannot make a graphic for you. So if you
Mhm.
want that, it's probably someone on their marketing department, assuming they're like a 1,000 employee company that can
Well,
turn that around. And yeah,
even some of these smaller companies, oh, hi, Kenny. We love Project PRC. we even some smaller companies, I'm starting to see it more and more and more, where you've got some smaller boutique kind of companies who are, they might not have a full-time marketing person or a full-time social media person, but social media has become so important to the marketing landscape that they do have them. They have a kid that comes in 10 hours a week and makes TikToks for them or whatever. So I think what I'm getting at is, at the end of the day, you never know if you don't ask. So if you don't have the capability to do something on your own, just being open about that, and you never know what they're going to say. They might say, "Oh, that's what we meant. We would make it for you," or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think that my last thing that I just kind of want to talk about is, I don't have any more questions. If anyone has any more questions, please put them in the chat. I will definitely ask Grace. And if Grace can't answer them, I will somehow find out the answer. Maybe you can email me or something, but we'll figure it out. So please feel free to put them in the chat. The last thing that I really kind of want to do is just kind of go back through our conversation, talk about a few key takeaways. And then I'm going to drop a link in here if anyone is interested in doing a demo for Double Donation, which they have two options. Grace, correct me if I'm wrong, two options. One is more of a self-led demo, and one is more of like a demo with their, I don't know that you call it customer success, but with their customer success like team. So please feel free to, hop in and kind of explore Double the Donation. But Grace, if there were, just a handful of things that you wanted people to really take away from this conversation, what would those things be?
Yeah, I think something that you actually just said would be like the tagline of corporate social responsibility, and that is, if you don't ask, you don't get. And so it's really this idea, especially with CSR initiatives, and as people are kind of pioneering these programs and figuring out what works and adapting and changing and so on and so forth, is that you as a nonprofit are in a great position to ask for help and receive it from companies that want to both give back and reap the benefits of giving back. And so I think that's definitely something to kind of take advantage of and leverage to have as your organization say, okay, these are the 3 things we're looking for a corporate sponsor this year. Let's go out and find one that makes the most sense for us. So I think just keeping that in mind and knowing that corporate social responsibility is out there and it's growing. And then also at the same time, connecting donors to these initiatives, if it's those like donor specific opportunities like payroll deductions or matching gifts or volunteer grants, things like that. If it's those type of initiatives that require donor awareness or donor action, I think as an organization, making sure that you have something in place to go ahead and connect them to that. It can be as simple as adding a call out for volunteer grants or a call out for matching gifts in your email, like what's the word I'm looking for? Signature. I wanted to say
Yeah.
subject line in your email
Yeah.
signature.
You got it.
Something like that. Maybe it's including like a little pamphlet or something in your typical direct mail where it mentions, hey, does your company want to work with us? Do you want to have a team for our upcoming event? And so just making sure that you kind of have some of those asks built into what you're already doing. And then, of course, kind of what we talked about both for the corporate side of things as well as the supporter side of things is meeting donors where they're at, where if it's you're in times of economic uncertainty or you're figuring things out, maybe there's turnover in your organization, turnover in the companies that you're partnering with, kind of whatever that may be, is understanding that the capacity to give may change over time. And that may look like I used to give $10 a month, now I give $10 a year, versus I used to volunteer once a month, now I volunteer 4 times a month. So I think just understanding that that capacity to give can change, but you don't want to lose the relationship just because that capacity to give may have changed.
Yeah. I think that the other thing when we're talking about capacity to give, the other thing to really think about is that there's this idea in the nonprofit sector that like there's only so much pie, right? Like everyone is only, you can't double dip in some ways, or if this company is already partnered with this company, they're not going to want to partner with me. And I got to say, I think that, generally speaking, that's usually not the case. And just to go back to your initial point, which is that if you don't, if you don't ask, you're not going to get. So what's the worst they're going to say? No. And then you're in the same position you were in before. So I
Exactly.
think really just not allowing yourself to hold yourself back because you're making assumptions about what another company's capacity is to give, whether that's through monetary, in kind, time, gifts. We have, let's see, Little Bear, I think I missed something. Can you clarify how getting corporate sponsors is done using double the donation? I understand the matching part using the database, but not the corporate sponsor aspect. Grace, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So with double the donation and kind of the analytics that it provides back to you, that's what we really recommend kind of leveraging to let you build corporate sponsorships. So this is going to get really technical for people who are not as familiar with double the donation, so I'm sorry. But within your 360 Match Pro dashboard, there's actually a component where you can see where your donors most often work. And so what we really recommend is kind of taking that and seeing if there's any valuable information there. Maybe there's a commonality with donors in a certain field. Maybe there's a commonality with donors in a certain profession, things like that, to allow you to kind of understand and build those relationships, especially if you are a local or like smaller organization where a lot of your donor base is centralized in one area. That's going to be a great opportunity because understanding where those people work could be the thing that kind of connects you to a company you'd never heard of or a company
Mm-hmm.
that you didn't realize was available or interested in corporate sponsorships. So it's a little bit more relational and analytical on that point.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily a direct, once you get this company, then they become a corporate sponsor type of thing, but it's just that information that you can use to build those corporate sponsorships and kind of have those relationships get started.
Yeah, so it's more about donor data and demographics. So while the 360 Match program does not have like a like sign up for a corporate sponsorship, kind of like tab or something like that, it's a little bit more about you have access to more data through double the donation than you would through your standard donation form, right? So we all know that the more forms you have on your donation form, the less likely people are to complete them. So you're not asking where they work, you're not asking what industry they work in, and so you don't always have the same amount of data. But however, because it's a corporate matching program, double donation has data that allows you to kind of see like where these gifts are coming from and who's matching them. And then, like Grace said, it's really a matter of taking that data and extrapolating it out into understanding where a big portion of your donors are coming from, whether she's, like she said, a company or an industry. So I hope that clarified things for you. Unless we have any more questions, I think that we are kind of ready to wrap it up. So as just a reminder, please feel free, scroll back through. There's a bunch of links in there. More information about the GiveWP integration, specifically with double the donation, and using a demo with double donation. We do have another question. Hold on. Do small nonprofits see an increase in donations immediately, or does it typically take longer for small organizations to see an ROI for this? Can you clarify? Do you mean CSR initiative partnerships in general, or do you mean like corporate gift matching specifically? Let's see if we get a response. Okay, maybe they'll answer as we go. So, Grace, I'll let you speak to this in a little bit too, but I think either way, whether we're talking about initiatives or whether we're talking about corporate gift matching, they mean for gift matching. Okay, Grace, then you can answer that one.
One thing that I do want to call out just about CSR initiatives in general, but especially about corporate gift matching, especially as it relates to this word immediately, I think that's the hard one because there is no like, this is exactly how you do a CSR initiative guidebook for companies. And so I do think that small nonprofits can see an increase in donations, but it may not always be immediate because of the way the disbursement process actually works. And so you may see an uptick in matching gifts, or you may use that like donor data to leverage different relationships and things in that way, but you may not see an immediate return until that sponsorship comes to fruition or that match request gets approved by the company and then is actually dispersed. So I do think that it is definitely possible for a small nonprofit to see an increase in donations relatively quickly, but it's just not always a guaranteed thing that it's going to happen by next week because some companies are matching on a quarterly, everything to kind of pile out, move on and ship those
Mhm.
out. Their request comes in, we are going to disperse it no matter how much it costs. So maybe it's $10 to disperse, maybe it's $1,000 to disperse. They submit it right then and there. So I think that it just kind of depends on the disbursement process. But I think
Mhm.
any organization kind of putting energy into finding matching gifts, finding corporate sponsorships, engaging donors in that way is going to see an eventual return on that.
And I think it does go back to something we were talking about earlier, which is a matter of like how well a company lets their employees know that they do match gifts. So that it's kind of tough because you have the ability to, using 360 match to kind of go through and like allow folks to select that. But it's also a matter of even that donor knowing that their company matches a gift. So it is really hard to kind of determine like whether or not there will be an immediate thing based on disbursement, but also just based on whether or not folks know that their companies are doing that. So it's really helpful, especially on your end, when you're taking donations, not only to have like the double the donation like kind of integration, but to somehow kind of like remind folks that there are a lot of companies that do corporate gift matching, whether or not they know it. And so it can be definitely a little bit tricky. Go ahead, little bear. What's your last question? I feel like I'm on a radio show. Next caller. Let's wait for that one to come in and then we'll go. We'll go for it.
And I think one thing that we'll call out while we wait for the question also is
Mhm.
that the idea that you can continue to mention CSR always. Like it doesn't have to
Mhm.
be that you send out one newsletter that says, "Hey, don't forget about matching gift programs," and then leave it at that. It can
Right.
be something that's constantly reminded, especially as we see people leaving and changing jobs more often. Maybe
Mhm.
their previous company didn't offer a matching gift program, but their new one does. Maybe their new one doesn't and their previous one did. So now they're going to be the driving force behind the new matching gift company or program at their new
Mhm.
company.
Right. And that's super important to think about because I think we get really tripped up on this like um idea of like asking too many things, which yes, of course, you don't want competing CTAs and things like that, but it is something that if you feel that, your corporate gift matching program is super important, or it's the same with recurring donations or fee recovery or whatever it is that's making the biggest difference to your organization, to go ahead and just take that moment as just a short little reminder in a PS in your newsletter, or drop, a short little banner in and remind folks like, don't forget, we do corporate gift matching. Make sure your company does it. At the end of the day, those folks are going to remember and they're going to check, and then you're going to have a new match. And that's super important. Okay. The question is, how many companies are in the double donation database and are more added frequently?
Great question. Easy answer. We've got around or over 24,000 companies in the database, which is accounting for roughly 26 million people in the
Mhm.
United States. And yes, more are added frequently, at least as far as new programs being created. And then also similarly, if an existing program is updated. We've got a
Mhm.
whole database team that's kind of dedicated to making sure those numbers and program information are as accurate as possible. So we're definitely trying our hardest to make sure that that is as relevant and as applicable to donors as possible, but upwards of 24,000.
Mhm. And then I have a question. So let's say that there's a company that is not in the double donation database. How do you suggest that, if you're watching, like let's just say you're not even a nonprofit necessarily, but how do you suggest folks go about finding out if their company even matches gifts? They're not in the database. You're not really sure. Like you said, it's buried on page 72 of your employee handbook. It's as simple as just emailing HR, or what's the deal?
I think HR is a good place to start. And it's just, hey, do we have a matching gift program? And starting there, you can also, depending on the size of your company or the size of the company, you can just Google insert company matching gift program. That's a great
Mhm.
place to start. You could Google matching gift program and you'd have some information there. So I think just really putting in a little effort on the front end to figure out if that a company might have a matching gift program. And if they aren't in our database, we have a couple of different ways that you can let us know, because we definitely want to know that and make sure that our database is as robust as possible. But I
Mhm.
think if you're looking to figure out if your company has this offering, it's just checking in with HR, maybe asking around if anyone of your coworkers has heard of this before. And then if there's not, one, we have a couple of different resources on our website about how you can actually advocate for a matching gift program at your company if there isn't one already.
Mhm. Perfect. Okay, well, we are actually like right at time. So, really great job. Thanks for all of your questions today. And Grace, thanks so much for having, or I was going to say for having us on, but we're having you on. So, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. And folks, if you have questions, you can shoot me an email at camber@givewp.com. I am always happy to answer them. And I have a direct line to Grace. So, if I need to ask her something, I can. But Grace, again, thanks so much for coming on and chatting with us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Camber. And thank you to everyone who was tuning in and chatting with us and being here. I really appreciate it and am excited to be able to do things like this. So thank you again, Camber. And like she mentioned, you have a direct line through to me. So we'll get your questions answered if you have
We
any.
sure will. All right, we are out of here. Thank you.